I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. A big win for Joe Biden. The president signed his $1 trillion public works bill on Monday. It took months of wrangling to get it through Congress, but the outlook for his Build Back Better spending plan still uncertain. Some moderate Democrats say the spending will make inflation worse, and it's already plenty bad. Consumer prices surged in October at the fastest pace in over 30 years, led by everything from food to gasoline. Inflation is something voters directly feel in their wallets. It could be grave as a political threat to Biden and the Democrats. Meanwhile, the Republicans have fired up the culture wars, and that's a potent political tool too. Glenn Youngkin won the Virginia governor's race. He championed parents' rights regarding school curriculum, especially the teaching of critical race theory. Republican politicians also fighting mask and vaccine mandates. Ted Cruz even attacked Big Bird for a tweet encouraging kids to get the COVID vaccine. And Aaron Rodgers, the Green Bay Packers star quarterback, suddenly became a darling of right-wing media for being anti-vax. He got COVID and missed a game, which his team lost. The tribal cultural anger extended to Republicans who voted for the public works bill. The Times wrote, quote, in Congress, violent threats against lawmakers are on track to double this year. Republicans who break party rank and defy former President Donald Trump have come to expect insults, invective, and death threats, often stoked by their own colleagues and conservative activists who have denounced them as traitors. Worth a mention, the direction of the country poll from Political Morning Consult, 39% say right direction, 61% wrong track. So just how powerful a political weapon for Republicans are these culture wars, and how big a political threat to the Dems is inflation? We're joined by Lisa Lerer, a national political correspondent for the New York Times, and Reid Epstein, a political correspondent for the Times. Lisa, you wrote the other day in the Times that threats of violence have been commonplace among a significant part of American politics for ages. Historians say that this has not been uncommon. What's different about today?
Well, when you talk to historians and people who study democracy, political scientists, they say what's changed now is that you have a major political party, a wing of which is actively promulgating these kinds of threats and this kind of violent rhetoric, would talk of things like revolution and insurrection. And you have the remainder of the party, the Republican leadership, that's largely letting them pass. There's no opposition. There's no Republicans standing up and saying this kind of rhetoric is not good for our democracy and it needs to stop. You just don't hear that. So this sort of elite acquiescence, acceptance of this kind of language is really what makes this moment different than, say, the moments that they're looking for as a historical parallel, like the 60s, 1960s or 70s, or even the 1850s in the run-up to the Civil War.
Let's look at one way that the Republicans are sort of manipulating this system, the same way, frankly, that the Democrats have when they have the power. Reid Epstein, you wrote in the Times the other day that gerrymandering, which of course goes back to almost colonial times, Governor Jerry, or I think he referred to himself at the time as Gary, started that system with salamander-shaped districts. I thought we solved the problem by creating independent redistricting commissions.
Well, actually, it goes back even farther than that. Patrick Henry, in the very first Congress in 1788, in 1789, the legislators in the Virginia General Assembly tried to draw him out of a congressional district over a fight they had. Gary in Massachusetts just had the misfortune of irritating the wrong newspaper editor in Boston, who labeled his creation the gerrymander, or the Garymander at the time. But what we're seeing now is sort of accumulation of decades of sort of this political polarization that's sort of reached its latest peak now. And there are just there are going to be far fewer competitive congressional districts in the midterm elections, frankly, than we've seen in generations. Just look at Texas, for example. In 2020, there were 36 congressional districts in Texas. 14 of the 36 had a margin in the presidential race of 10 points or less. Now, Texas got 2 new seats to add in the reapportionment this year. So they had 38 seats to draw for the next 10 years. Only 3 of those 38 seats would have had a presidential margin of 10 points or less. And so we're seeing the parties, mostly the Republicans, just because frankly they have control of more than twice as many congressional seats to draw as Democrats do, drawing these districts intentionally to be uncompetitive, to draw as many for themselves as possible and packing as many Democrats as they can into the fewest number of seats.
And Reid, is this subject to any kind of review? Can the courts really do anything about it? And frankly, should it be left to the courts, or should this be left to elected officials?
Well, it depends. The last question depends on who you ask. The first question, the Supreme Court has ruled that gerrymandering for partisan reasons is within the bounds of the Constitution. They have not answered the question about whether gerrymandering for racial purposes is within the bounds of the Constitution. And that's going to be one of the questions that gets answered in the next few years as we see lawsuits about the new maps percolate through the system. And particularly in Alabama, Republican lawmakers in Alabama drew 1 Democratic seat out of 7 in Alabama, where a lot of civil rights activists and Democratic leaders and African-American leaders thought there should have been 2 Black seats or 2 Democratic seats in Alabama. And so that's going to be one of the questions that courts and ultimately the Supreme Court has to decide, both on the question of Alabama's map and then the broader question about whether some of these questions of race can be considered in drawing legislative maps. The other question about like who should ultimately have authority to do this, the Constitution grants the authority to the state legislatures, and now some state legislatures and some states through constitutional referenda have delegated that authority to outside panels, independent redistricting commissions. Iowa, which has the oldest sort of nonpartisan system, has a nonpartisan career legislative staff draw the maps. Other places have their Supreme Courts do it. And so it's a question that, there's 50 different states. There's, dozens of different methods that these maps get drawn. And one of the things that the Democratic Congress has tried and failed to do this year is implement a federal standard on redistricting that was in the voting rights bill that passed the House this year, but has not gotten much of a hearing into the Senate.
Lisa Lerer, one of the things you said in that story the other day is that political violence, while it has been part of the American story for a long time, has now been embraced by a sizable portion of one party, and that, of course, being the Republican Party at the moment. Has there been any blowback to that? And has there been any profiles and courage of people within the party who are saying, that's going too far?
Well, there have been a handful of Republicans who have stepped up and said, criticized the party. One prominent example, of course, is Liz Cheney, but they've largely been faced blowback themselves from the party. They face censure back home. They face calls for them to leave the Republican Party altogether. Many of them are facing primary challenges. So there hasn't been anything from Republican leadership. In fact, one interesting thing that happened during the reporting of that story was we, of course, asked Republican leaders in the House and the Senate, outside of Congress, to weigh in on this and say what they thought of this turn in the party's rhetoric. And one of them sent back a statement condemning it, but would not put a name to it. That it was too controversial to put your name to a statement condemning political violence So they wouldn't do it. And I think what that reflects is that there is this very sizable portion, about a third plus or minus, that says when they're asked in polling, and the number varies a little based on how the question is asked, that they can see a scenario in which violence would be justified in politics to achieve, sort of the ends they want to see. And it's not just that that is about a third of the party. It's a third of the party that is perhaps the most active and engaged voters. They tend to be more conservative. They tend to be more engaged in politics generally. So you do get the sense that Republican leaders are scared of alienating a portion of their own base by condemning things that really could be quite dangerous for democracy.
Aren't they scared that somehow this violence will actually manifest itself and they'll be blamed for it?
Well, it did manifest, right? I mean, there was January 6th. Yeah. I don't think that's the thing. I'm sure privately, some say they are scared about that. And of course, many members of Congress, part of the real world implications of this, if we've seen members of Congress just get these threats have escalated. They're on track to double this year against lawmakers. And that's Democrats, that's Republicans, particularly those who break party ranks and vote for things like impeaching Donald Trump or, for this bipartisan infrastructure bill that you mentioned in the intro. And some of those threats are really quite nasty. It's not just obscene phone calls, it's threats to their home. Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, who's a Democrat from Michigan, told me she went home and there were guys with assault weapons standing outside her house. So we have seen the real world impacts of this already, for sure.
Reid, 51% of people polled say they would vote for the Republicans in their district in Congress. That's the most since 1981. Are we talking about issues that the president, even Congress, can't really do anything about? Supply chain shortages, maybe illegal border crossings, the persistence of COVID, Afghanistan, critical race theory, even inflation. Are these beyond the control of Congress or the president at this moment?
I mean, Lisa and I talked with a Republican strategist this week who told us, the biggest issue in the elections that happened a couple of weeks ago in Virginia and New Jersey was basically just the prices, the cost of living and the price of stuff, and that people are seeing that it costs more to put gas in their car or to buy groceries. And that's sort of a function that President Biden has minimal control over. There's a broader supply chain issue. There's the issue that, over the last 20 months of the pandemic, Americans and people around the world have been buying more stuff and fewer services. And so that's created a bit of a logjam for people who are trying to buy automobiles or couches or food. And so that, until that supply and demand issue is addressed, and that's not necessarily something that the White House or any government has all that much control over, that people are going to be anxious about how they see the economy, or at least the economy in their world. And I think we'll see the White House do whatever it can to keep wages apace with cost of things or keep costs down. But they frankly don't have all that much control, over what a gallon of milk costs.
Lisa, we've seen schools be a focal point in the culture wars at various times before. It's manifested itself in terms of busing. It manifested itself to some extent in terms of gay rights and what kind of books are used in the schools. How did schools now become, again, this pivotal point in the culture wars?
Well, I think schools is an issue in the culture wars, and the kinds of things you're talking about, like critical race theory, really rally the conservative base, and that's why you see Republicans talking about them. But I do think we are in a really unique moment when it comes to parents and kids and schools, which is that we are still in the midst of this pandemic that is now upending its third school year. So you have this situation where for parents, that's caused huge ripple effects in their lives. It's caused a historic number of women to drop out of the workforce. It's hard to overstate how disruptive the past 2 years have been for families. And so I think you have this sense of sort of free floating rage from parents who are frustrated. Maybe it's about, if you're conservative, maybe it is about like what's being taught in the curriculums. But even for independents or liberal parents, it's about the persistence of COVID. It's about the uncertainty. It's about the quarantines. It's about how your school or how the federal government or how your state government handled all of this. I think there's a sense that parents were largely abandoned in this very, very difficult time for the past 2 years, and they're really mad. And free floating rage generally does not help the party in power. So that's why I think schools is such a powerful force in our politics right now. And it sort of goes along with the things that Reid was just talking about. These are like sort of daily life issues for Americans. What is the cost of milk? Are my kids in school today? Or are we figuring out some remote situation? How much is gas? And while the president may not have a huge amount of control over these issues, I think by going out and touting the infrastructure bill, which doesn't have the same resonance in everyday lives, given how long some of those projects will take to come from fruition, you do have to wonder whether they're missing an opportunity to really connect with the issues that people are most concerned about right now.
And the other thing I would add to
how
that,
long it will take and how much it will cost. Yes, Reid.
I mean, Sam, the thing I would add to that is, this administration pushed through the rescue plan earlier this year, and now the infrastructure bill. And one of the things that's happened is they've delegated the distribution of a lot of these funds to local governments. And so the federal government may have sent, hundreds of thousands of dollars to, the city of Wausau, Wisconsin, but it's the mayor of Wausau who's handing out the checks to local community organizations or announcing these grants. And people don't put two and two together to see that it's come from the Biden administration. They sort of see these as local projects. How
do they get away with that? Why is Congress, especially congressmen and women, allowing that to happen?
It's a good question. I mean, we've seen they're not great at marketing their own accomplishments. And frankly, we've also seen just in the last few days since the infrastructure bill was passed and President Biden signed it this week, we've seen Republican members of Congress taking credit for projects in their district on a bill that they voted against. And there's not been a whole lot of like serious backlash for that, other than people snarking about it on social media. And so I think we're going to see more of that over the course of this year as roads and bridges projects and infrastructure things happen. You're going to see Republicans who voted against this legislation try to take credit for it and probably show up in hard hats at some of these groundbreakings.
A lot of naming opportunities. Thanks for Lisa Lerer and Reid Epstein of the New York Times. And coming up next, a Times investigation into how New York City failed abused children who were beaten to death. A few weeks ago, the Times published a startling and disturbing investigation into the beating deaths of several children. These children seem to have fallen through the cracks of the agencies that are supposed to protect them from child abuse. The Times wrote, quote, "The series of killings has exposed the holes in a multi-agency safety net from social workers to detectives where a wrong decision could mean the death of a child." In these cases, that's exactly what happened. The agencies tasked with protecting these children failed them. The Times also wrote, quote, "Several children died even after their cases had been escalated to the city's instant response team, a task force whose stated mission is to protect children from mistreatment by ensuring that evidence is gathered in a timely, effective, and coordinated manner." Kids' lives are on the line. Why is the city failing abused children? And what is being done to change how city agencies respond to these cases? Ashley Southall is a Times law enforcement reporter. Her byline was on this investigation, along with Andy Newman and Chelsea Rose Marcus. Ashley, why did these kids die? We're always going to have some level of deaths in the system, But what went wrong in these three cases?
Well, we found that was kind of hard to pin down. I mean, you can't, oftentimes abuse plays out behind closed doors. But in these cases, there were prior 911 calls, complaints of children showing up to school with bruises or in public with unexplained bruises. And so the bureaucracy that is supposed to protect him, which is mainly the Child Welfare Service and the NYPD, showed up and in some cases either didn't notice things or forgot to do things or didn't do things that might have extended them an extra layer of protection and might have prevented their deaths.
One of the things you pointed out in the story, which unfortunately is true, is that it's easier to look back and see how tragedy might have been averted than to predict when mortal danger lies ahead. What is the prevailing wisdom now? Is it better to keep kids with their parents or to remove them and keep them safer? Who do you give the benefit of the doubt to?
Sure. The prevailing wisdom among New York City and the child welfare system is that it's better for kids to be with their parents in situations that might be a little chaotic, but it's better than the effect on the child than if they had been separated or if they would be separated. So the city tries its best to reunite children with families in some cases, and that goes to some degree with the science that where children triangulate the authorities, their parents, and themselves. And if you're taking them away from their kids, that might further also alienate them from the system and impede their developmental growth. But there's also just concerns that some parents just are not capable of caring for their children, whether it's because of their own developmental challenges or because they just aren't equipped with the skills to take care of a young child.
In previous cases of child abuse, and when the numbers have gotten higher than average, there's been blame given to understaffing, to lack of training. Does that seem to be the case here at all?
For sure, the NYPD in particular, their Special Victims Division was the subject of a city audit that found that it was gravely understaffed and that that detectives were in many cases taking shortcuts to close investigations. And one of the things that we found that we were told during our investigation was that the NYPD investigation often ends very quickly. They're looking for a probable cause to arrest. So when they go and see a child and they don't see any bruises or anything that's kind of obvious, there's very little investigation after that. They will make a medical referral if necessary, or if they deem it necessary, which is entirely another issue in these cases. And then fairly quickly, the investigation is closed when there might be a situation where there's a new man in the house who has a violent criminal history, and that hasn't been discovered or investigated. And in some cases, with these children, that is the person who is being held responsible for their deaths.
The city said last week, you quoted officials as saying they'd make a series of changes to keep closer watch over families that have been the subject of a report of suspected abuse. How are they going to do that?
Well, mainly it's by more visits. The NYPD is going to start showing up each time there's any kind of complaint about a child possibly being abused. And what that means is that that's just going to put families in much more contact with the authorities. We did, in response to that story, receive the overwhelming feedback was positive, but that was one of the critiques of the story, that we did not fully flesh out that this meant what advocates thought was more harassment for families. Kids have bruises and black eyes in the normal course of just horsing around. And now that's possibly going to result in families being subject to police visits and having to go to child advocacy centers and wait and go through all these appointments and bureaucracy. And it's just going to be a further burden on families. What we strove to try to bring out in the story was that, the city already has protocols that in some cases, and especially in some of these cases, those steps were not taken.
Was there any other response by the city to your series of articles?
the changes that were announced, the city for weeks put off responding to us or gave us kind of a short end, but then they came around to develop these changes and put them forward to us. And we were able to kind of look at them and say, and get some feedback on them from people who had worked in these capacities. But it's a very tough thing to regulate, to police and to find and to prevent child abuse. It's not clear if any of those changes are going to be effective. One of the changes that they're not making is increasing staffing on the child abuse squads, which again, that 2018 audit pointed out that they were understaffed along with the rest of the division.
One of the people you quote in the story, Anthony Wells, said something that really was quite profound. He said, child welfare is the only agency that's expected to have 100% success stories. I guess there is no acceptable level of deaths by child abuse in the city. Nothing is good. You can't have one that you can say is an acceptable level. Ashley Southall of the New York Times, thank you for joining us. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.